Yes, make sure you do that.
Okay, it is recording. Did you need help logging in again?
Chris said he'd be down when his foot's really hurting. Maybe he'll be down later.
You should just download the Zoom app, but you're not there yet, so.
No, just play however you can do it. If you can't get me in, I'm sitting here listening to you anyhow. I guess I'll use this one.
Do you know how to get in, Sarah?
What?
Do you know how to get into the Zoom meeting, or are you just gonna listen?
Oh yeah, I'm just gonna listen.
Oh, man.
Grandma just shook her booty at me. That was creepy.
Why
A
you
little
still
scary.
refrigerator get his soda?
But I shook her booty in the process.
Right.
Are you?
He said he was.
Oh.
It's recording. I just started recording now, so
Can you crop it?
for anybody who's watching this, you can probably fast forward past the beginning part.
Can you crop it?
I'm sure I can.
Well, please do.
This is so always so difficult.
Oh, you have to be 60 to get it there.
Okay, there you go. All right, I'm gonna wait a couple more minutes to see if anybody else shows up. Excuse me. I am not sure how interested people are in continuing to do the Zoom. We've had a very low turnout for the Zoom meeting, but when I post to Facebook Live, I get a much better response from people who want to watch it at their convenience. So I may go back to just doing Facebook Live instead of going through all of the work of downloading the Zoom video and uploading it to Facebook, and also paying the monthly fee for Zoom. If we can do everything from Facebook Live, and that's where most people are getting the info. So we're going to go ahead and continue. So this week we are looking at the Midah of faith. We're continuing on our study in Mussar. So we're going to be looking at faith from a biblical perspective. What is faith? Naturally, in our youth, when we think about our youth, questions come to mind about some of the great mysteries that confound the human mind. Some of those great mysteries that we oftentimes ask is, what's the purpose of life? Why are we here? Is this all there is? How can God always be? And one of the most difficult ones to answer is, how does a loving God allow evil to exist? How does a loving God allow evil to exist? These questions oftentimes come to us when we're experiencing loss, a great loss or a great hurt in our lives. We oftentimes bring these questions up, Lord, where were you? What happened during this part of my life? Where were you when I didn't feel your presence at that moment? Or maybe I didn't at that moment, I didn't sense your guidance in my life. And it's very natural. It's very natural for us to have some of those questions. So when we're talking about faith, it's important to understand that these questions do not define faith. Questions about, when we ask questions like, God, where are you? Okay. Or what about this promise in my life? Why haven't I seen that fulfilled yet? Or why am I struggling in this area so often? Or why does it seem that good people oftentimes suffer the most and bad people seem to get away with a lot of things? These are natural questions to ask, and asking those questions is not a lack of faith. It's what we do with it that becomes a lack of faith, and how we go forward. Okay. Some of us turn away from these questions and we hide from these questions in the business of life. We'd rather, try to embrace things that would cause us to forget about these questions because they're overwhelming. Others, like myself, I have a tendency to become, maybe even a little obsessive about those things. So when I have a question that I can't answer, I obsess on it until I can find something that will ultimately satisfy me. So I will dig and I will dig and I will dig and I will dig and I will dig until I find something that provides an answer that brings an easiness to my soul. The difficulty is that no matter how hard we try, there are going to be answers that we can never, there are going to be questions that we can never answer. There's always going to be questions that we can never answer. And that's where true faith comes into play. This is one of the most challenging midah for a lot of people, including myself. Even for the most resolute amongst us, God does not allow our faith to remain static, because a fully resolute faith is ultimately a dead faith. Let me say that one more time. A fully resolute faith is ultimately a dead faith. Our faith must be dynamic. Like I spoke last week when we were speaking, about truth, okay, in regards to search for truth. And in regards to our theology, our theology can never be static, but our theology must be dynamic. Our theology must be growing and maturing. And so it is with our faith, okay? All it takes is a mustard seed, just the smallest amount of faith, and God will reach out to us and God will grab a hold of that. But he's never ultimately satisfied with just a small mustard seed of faith. He wants to grow our faith. That's one of the reasons I believe it took, we're going to talk about Abraham just here in just a moment, but it's one of the reasons I think it took Abraham a long time before he can embrace the promise that God would give him, that he would have a child. He would have a child that was not Ishmael, but he would have a child with Sarah. And Abraham had to embrace that, and God had to grow his faith until he could fully embrace that. I struggle with that myself. And trying to wrap my mind around that, and fully embracing the promises that God has for me, and not getting tangled up in discouragement and frustration and anger and hurt, but to try to continue on. We live in a world that it is very difficult because we live in a society that wants instant gratification. We live in a society that wants to be entertained. We don't want to be questioned. We don't want to question our faith. We don't want to try to push ourselves. Certainly, we don't try to push our faith, and try to make our faith grow because, hey, look, we're pretty comfortable where we're at. And if we're comfortable, we don't want to be made uncomfortable. And that's where much of us today, as the body of the Messiah, much of us today are in that position where we are just too comfortable, and we don't want to put ourselves into that position where we are uncomfortable. But that's ultimately where our faith grows, is when we are uncomfortable. And I have to remind myself of that all the time. So our faith should be dynamic. Our faith should be growing and maturing, right? Okay. The facts of life challenge us ultimately at every turn. God uses these challenges in our lives to shake us from our resoluteness and cause our faith to mature and grow. Have you ever asked the question, what is faith? What do we mean by faith? Ultimately, I'm hesitant to offer a definition. And I ask you to bear in mind that faith is not something to be understood intellectually. That's one of the reasons I'm hesitant to give a definition of faith, because faith is not meant to be understood intellectually, but can only be fully appreciated from our spiritual life experiences. faith and our spiritual life experiences are ultimately tied together. It's not something that you think about. It's not something that you've convinced yourself of. It is something that you do. Just as I spoke last week about truth. Truth is not something that you've convinced yourself of. Truth is something that you live. Truth is something that becomes a part of you. And so it is with faith. From a biblical Hebraic perspective, faith, the Hebrew word emunah, faith, is not something that you think about, but faith is something that you do, okay? I will attempt to provide, with this understanding, we'll attempt to provide a Hebraic definition of faith. Before giving you that definition, we must examine the Hebrew Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to be looking at a few different passages, a couple of different passages anyways, on how the term faith is used. It's in virtually every example of the Hebrew Bible, faith, emunah, is used within context of being faithful and devoted, or in contrast, being faithless and rebellious. So that Hebrew concept of faith is used, again, within its context, is almost always used in virtually every example of being faithful and devoted, in contrast to being rebellious and stubborn and faithless. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples here. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9 says this: "Know therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, and a faithful God, who keeps covenant kindness for 1,000 generations with those who love him, and he keeps his commandments." And keep his commandments. So here, this is described, Moses is describing God here. He is God, the faithful God. So Moses describes God as the faithful God who keeps his covenant of kindness. Okay, for 1,000 generations. So Moses is describing God as a faithful God, but then immediately describes God as doing something. God is being faithful to the covenant. Okay, here's another example. In 1 Samuel 14:33. "And then they reported to Saul, behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood. You have acted faithlessly." You have acted faithlessly. So here, and we can look at a number of examples, but here's just two examples of how emunah, faith, is used in connection to what you are doing, or what you are being. What you are being. You are either being faithful or you are being faithless. Are you being faithful or are you being faithless? So let's look at, having understood to a certain degree what faith is from a Hebraic perspective, let's look at what faith is not, okay? I looked at the Google definition of faith. Google definition of faith says this: a strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based on a spiritual apprehension rather than proof. Here's the Bible Study Online Tools definition of faith: the conviction that God exists and is a creator and ruler of all things. Okay, both of these definitions fall radically short of the Hebrew definition of faith. So it may technically fall within the English definition, but we've got to get down to the Hebrew. We got to understand what the Bible says, in its original language. And the original language, emunah, what does that mean? And neither one of these definitions fit for the biblical term emunah. They fall radically short. On Billy Graham's website, Billy Graham says this: faith is believing that something is true and then committing our lives to it. Oh, that's a lot closer. That's a lot closer. Faith is believing that something is true and then committing our lives to it. That's a lot closer, but it's still somewhat incomplete. It's still incomplete, but Billy Graham's website does have a much better biblical definition than others. Okay. Excuse me. So let's look at the first time that the term faith or emunah is found in the Bible. The first time we found emunah in the Bible is in Genesis 15, verse 6. Genesis 15, verse 6. And Abraham questions God on why he had not yet had any children, and if Eliezer, his servant Eliezer, should be his heir. So Abraham's questioning God, and he says, okay, look, you know what? I haven't had any children yet, so is Eliezer to be my heir? Okay, and now let's look at what it says. I'm going to be looking at verses 5 and 6 here. He took him outside and he said, look up now at the sky and count the stars, if you're able to count them. And then he said to him, so shall your seed be. Then he believed in the Lord and he credited to him as righteousness. Okay, so in this translation, he believed in the Lord. That this translation, believe, I think, ultimately falls short of explaining Emunah. Okay, it does technically work because Abraham believed in him, but it was more than that. Abraham had faith in him, Emunah. So then he had faith in the Lord, and the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. What is the nature of Abraham's faith that God reckoned it to him as righteous? So God said, because of your faith, I reckon it to you as righteous. So what about Abraham's faith that God said that was declared, that Abraham was declared righteous because of his faith? What about Abraham's faith was so powerful and so strong? Okay, it is evident from the context that Abraham's faith was not a matter of accepting a series of propositions to be true. It was not a matter of just simply accepting, that, okay, God said it, I believe it, and that's it. Okay, but Abraham had to act upon it. This understanding of just believing, intellectually believing in
So faith is like
trust, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a very, very good way of putting it. You're absolutely right. Faith and trust is intimately tied together. Faith and trust, yes. That's really, really good. So when we think about faith in terms of believing in something intellectually, this is more based upon the Greek noun, the Greek word, which is pistis. Is transliteration, is pistis. It is translated to be persuaded or convinced. Okay, so that would be like me trying to convince you of something. Okay, so I have argued, I've debated, then I've convinced you of my side of the argument, right? And you said, okay, yeah, I believe it. That makes sense, right? And you have intellectually believed my argument, but that's not the way the Bible describes faith. Okay, the Bible does not describe faith in the sense of, okay, God argued with Abraham and God convinced him of something. But it's much more intimate. It's much more detailed than that. You see, the Greek mind was caught up in the pursuit of a state of mindful bliss. So to the Greek mind, faith is oftentimes associated with a confession of a creed. Do you believe in A, B, C, D, E, F, G? Do you believe in all of these things? Great. You believe in those, then you have faith. Okay. This idea heavily influenced the 2nd and 3rd century church. For many Greeks, having faith was to accept that the gods existed. For many Greek Christians, to have faith was to accept that Yeshua exists, or Jesus exists, and he is real. It is about ultimately believing in the right doctrine. But doesn't James, the brother of the master, doesn't he teach us that even the demons also believe and they shudder? The demons believe and they shudder. They understand, they know that Jesus is the Messiah. They know that he has come and he will be their downfall. He will defeat them and they will be thrown into everlasting judgment. They know that. That's why they tremble. Faith has to be something more than just what you believe up here. This is why in the Hebrew concept, when we think of heart, okay, and the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your might. Okay, heart in Hebrew is not the same thing as a heart in English. So when you read, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, okay, we think of it as all your passions. Right? All of your passions, all of your emotions, all your feeling. And that's a part of it. But it's incomplete because heart in Hebrew did not represent the seat of emotion. Heart in Hebrew represented the entirety of the person. Okay, so to translate in Deuteronomy 6, to translate the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart. What Moses is saying here is that you shall love the Lord your God with all of your everything. Because he goes on to say, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, all your strength. Okay. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your everything, your entire being, from your brain, from your intellect to your seat of emotions to how you live. So the type of faith that God calls of us is similar to the heart. Okay, the type of faith that God calls of us is not just an intellectual belief. The type of faith that God calls of us is to have faith in God with all of our everything. That means everything we are, everything that we do. That includes the way we live. That means that faith, just like I spoke last week in truth should be a part of who we are. So it is with faith. Faith should be a part of who we are, not something we believe in, but a part of who we are. It should emanate from our very being. The Greek term pistos is used over 220 times in the Greek New Testament. So it's used a lot. However, it's important that we do not separate the Hebrew usage of emunah from the Greek text. Remember, as I've said many, many times, the Greek text that we have of the Newer Testament is the text that we have of the Newer Testament is Greek. Okay, that's what we have. But there is a Hebraic culture underlying that. There's a Hebraic culture just below the surface. And to understand what is being said, you have to understand that Hebraic culture. Okay. Just like all of the other rabbis of the first century, Jesus would have taught in Hebrew. He would have spoken Aramaic too, of course. But the rabbis, it was tradition for them to teach in Hebrew. How do we know that? We know that because we can see in some cases in the New Testament where the Greek translation is basically a transliteration of the Hebrew. So they will transliterate from the Hebrew into Greek because the Greek does not convey the proper meaning. Okay, so we know that the culture and the language that was spoken behind it is Hebrew. So when Jesus was teaching his disciples about faith, he was speaking to them from a Hebraic perspective, from a first century Jewish Hebraic perspective, and he was using that very phrase, a very idea, the heart of Emunah. Emunah, that is to be faithful, that is to be devoted, that is to dedicate your whole entire being. Let's look at a couple of examples here. In Matthew 9, verse 2. And just then, some people brought him a paralyzed man lying on a cot. All seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralyzed man, "Take courage, son, your sins are forgiven." So it's here, Yeshua said that he saw their faith. How can he see their faith unless they were doing something? He saw something that they were doing as an act of faith. Matthew 23:23 says, "Woe to you, Torah scribes and scholars, hypocrites! You tithe mint and dill and cumin, yet you have neglected the weightier matters of the Torah. That is justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Faithfulness. Romans 5:1. The Apostle Paul says this: "Through him we have received grace and the office of the emissary, to bring about obedience of faith." Now, think about that for a second. Here's the Apostle Paul saying, to bring about the obedience of faith among all the nations on behalf of his name. The obedience of faith. What does that mean? Well, we might try to twist it and say that by having faith, we are being obedient, but that's not what it's saying here. You can't disconnect the idea of faithfulness and devotion from emunah, okay? And that traditional Jewish understanding of faith being connected to how you live and what you do. So what the Apostle Paul is saying here is that obedience out of love, obedience to the Messiah is an act of faithfulness, is an act of faith. Obedience to the Messiah is an act of faith, okay? Though the Greek term pistis is used, it is obvious from the context that the Hebrew term emunah is what is in mind here. Remember, we are speaking of a first century Jewish Hebrew culture. Emunah itself comes from the root word aman in the Bible, which too, aman is a verb. Aman conveys the deeper concept of trust and fidelity. So there you go, Sarah. That's what you were just talking about, right? So faith is trust, right? Well, faith, the root word of faith is aman, which basically means to trust and to be faithful, to show fidelity. As with our father Abraham, he trusted in the future promised by God as expressed in his present trust. Okay, this is why he was called a great man of faith, because he trusted in God. Would he have been a great man of faith if he didn't leave his father's house like God told him to? Would he be a great man of faith if he came to the land and he wasn't faithful? He didn't take his son Isaac to Mount Moriah and to be willing to offer him up as a sacrifice?
That would take faith.
That would take a lot of
For
faith.
us.
Think about the amount of faith that was there, because God promised that Isaac would be the heir apparent. So that meant that Abraham had to believe that if he sacrificed Isaac, that God would raise him from the dead, that God would resurrect him and bring him back to life. Now, that's a lot of faith. That is a lot of faith. And that's where we see Abraham's faith really flourishing. When he gets to that point where he demonstrates his faith by being faithful and following God's voice and doing what God said to do and being willing to do what God said to do, that is what solidified Abraham's faith. That's what made it so powerful and so strong, because he believed and his belief caused him to do.
Is there such a thing as too much faith?
No, I don't.
What I'm getting at, there's people in religion that deliberately will not take their children to a doctor, don't get them vaccinated.
No, I think that's too much stupid.
Yeah, they say it's all faith and God's not gonna let anything happen, so they don't get them vaccinated, they don't take them to the doctor.
Well, I mean, I'm going to avoid the whole vaccine argument
They
and
go
whether
to
or not
court
you should
over-
get
Yeah, they go
vaccinations.
to
But
court over that.
in terms of not taking your children to the doctor and things like that, I think that denies the gifts and talents and abilities that God has given
But
doctors.
it does happen quite a bit.
It does on some occasions, and I would say that that's not too much faith. It's just too much stupid. So I'll just be blunt. It's just too much stupid. Anyways, so then how are we to properly understand what faith is? Okay, it was Pastor Steve Shell said this, and I thought it was very, very good. And Steve Shell summed it up like this. He said, faith is where your feet go. Faith is where your feet go. And I couldn't agree more. But I think there's another element I would like to add on to what Pastor Steve Shell says, and that is faith trusts in the promise of God. Faith trusts in the promises of God. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So faith is where your feet go, and faith trusts in the promises of God. Those are the two best definitions of faith that I've heard.
What if you have a lot of faith in God and what you're asking for don't happen? That discourages some people, I would think, when they say, well, they know God's going to do this and that, and then it don't happen.
Well, let's go back to the promise of Abraham. Okay. We know the promise that was given to Abraham. God changed Abraham's name from Abram to Abraham, or Avram to Avraham, from father to father of many.
Mhm.
Av is father. Okay. Avraham, father of many, and yet Abraham died the father of one under that covenant. Well, actually, he would have seen Jacob and Esau as well. At the very least, he would have seen Jacob and Esau. So but he died not seeing the fullness of that promise. He died trusting and believing that God will fulfill his promise, that he would make of him a great nation. So did that, Abraham not seeing that promise in this lifetime, did that mean God didn't fulfill it? Of course not. God will fulfill that. God will fulfill that promise. And that's something that we have to hold on to today, because we don't know. And again, boy, I keep coming back to this because I have to remind myself of this over and over and over again, because I'm stubborn, I'm bullheaded, and I get discouraged really easy.
Yeah.
You don't have to agree so easily, so quickly.
Amen to
But
that one.
the point is that we have to remember that we don't see the end game, and we don't know the impact that we're having on people's lives. We don't know how we're touching people's lives, and we don't know how the promises of God are going to unfulfill or going to fulfill. It may fulfill in this lifetime, but it may not. It may not be fulfilled in this lifetime. Maybe it'll be fulfilled in the lifetime to come. That's where we are to store up our treasures after all, right? That's where we're to store up our treasures. And that's why we got to keep on fighting, because we don't know the impact that we're going to have on the people around us. And we don't know how God is going to fulfill that. So even if you don't see the promises that God has given you in this lifetime, hold fast to the trust that it will be fulfilled, even if it's not in this lifetime, but it will be fulfilled ultimately. Okay. So Emunah is more akin to this idea of faithfulness, right? The Torah obviously assumes that God exists. So it's not about believing that God exists. The Torah assumes that God exists, but the Torah calls us to have faith. Okay, so it's more than just faith that God exists, but it's trusting in God. More importantly, the Torah goes to great lengths to express it that God is a promise-keeping God, that he makes promises and then he keeps them. In other words, it is not enough to get your doctrine correct. We are called to an active relationship with him, with the promise-keeping God, and rely upon him to ultimately keep his promises. We express emunah, we express faith by living in trust in the promises of God, living our current lives as if the promises of God have already been fulfilled. That's how we express faith. We trust in his promises, so much so that we are willing to live as if his promises are already fulfilled. Can you understand, how faith is active and maturing in us, how faith is active in us? It's not a one-time thing, okay? Having faith is not a one-time thing. I don't have faith. I don't have faith. I am learning to be faithful, if that makes sense. God is growing me and teaching me what it means to be faithful. I don't have faith in the sense that I've got it, I've captured it, I have all of it in here, I've convinced myself enough and it's all good. But I am learning to be faithful. God is teaching me and growing me and maturing me to be faithful. Even in my stubbornness, he is still teaching me about faithfulness, okay? I am learning that. It's active and it's growing in me, and I hope it's maturing in me and causing me to be more faithful and more devoted to him and to trust in him. Because the more faithful we are, the more obedient we are. Even in our desire to be more obedient, sometimes the lack of faith causes us to step away, causes us to not be as obedient as we should be. So the more obedient we are, the more faithful we are. The more faithful we are, the more we become obedient. It's two sides of the same coin. Are you following what I'm saying? The more obedient we are, the more God will teach us about faith. The more God teaches us about faith, the more we are willing to take the next step and be more obedient. And then I will be more faithful. And then I will be more obedient. I will be more faithful. It's two sides of the same coin. You can't disconnect the two. Being faithful leads to obedience. Being obedient and seeing God's promises unfold in my life leads to more faithfulness, which leads to more obedience. So it's not static, it's ever growing. That's why Abraham was called a great man of faith, but his faithfulness did not begin. He did not begin his ministry as this great man of faith. And in fact, when he got into the land that God had promised, he got into the land, he saw a famine, and he went straight down to Egypt, and God had to drag him back. Okay, so this great man of faith, whom we love and we adore, he is our spiritual father, our physical father, if you're a Jew or a Gentile. Okay, but he was not always this great man of faith, but God grew in him faith because he was obedient to God. Is any questions, thoughts? What do you have any questions here? I liked your insight about faith and trust, because I think the word trust is much closer to the Hebraic idea of faith and belief. To trust that Abraham trusted in God. So I think that's a really, really good interpretation. I would like that translation, of faith. I would like the translation trust to be more commonly used, because I think it does express the biblical idea a little bit better. All right. We didn't go that long. It's only been a little over half an hour. So we had a fairly short study this evening. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to close this out, and I will go ahead and post it on Facebook Live. First opportunity I get.
Are you doing Passover next Thursday?
We should be having a class next Thursday. It will be during Passover.
That's why I'm
But,
during Passover. You guys just show them the elements and stuff.
I don't plan on doing a Passover Seder Thursday night.
No, but you.
But if we don't do a class next Thursday, I will send out a notice on the Olive Center Facebook site. I will send out a notice that we are not doing it. But for now, I have plans on doing it next Thursday night. But for many of you, have a wonderful Passover starting Saturday night. Have a joyful Passover. And to those who are celebrating Easter, I would wish you a happy Easter as well. And we will see you next week. Ciao for now.
Sarah, we better eat our burgers on Saturday. Our ham